a rule that saved us. Have you ever reached a point where love feels quieter than your exhaustion, where even simple words sound heavy, and learning English feels like one more thing you're failing at? This video is not about perfect marriage or perfect fluency. It's about one quiet rule that saved our marriage during 4 intense weeks in the United States. While raising kids, struggling to listen, and relearning how to speak, slowly, honestly, in a language that isn't always kind. And I want to ask you something simple. Would you accept this rule? Here's the strange part. Our marriage didn't almost break because of big drama. No betrayal. No screaming matches. It weakened because of silence. The tired kind. The kind that creeps in when you're doing your best, but your nervous system has already clocked out. 4 weeks ago, in the US, our days started early. School runs. Groceries. Bills. English everywhere, on signs, in emails, in our kids' homework. And at night, when the house finally went quiet, we had nothing left to give each other. Not words. Not patience. Not even curiosity. You might think this is where couples talk it out. That's the advice, right? Communicate more. Express your feelings. Use better words. But neuroscience has an annoying truth. When your brain is overloaded, language is the first thing to collapse. The prefrontal cortex, the part that helps you explain, reason, and empathize, goes offline under chronic stress. So what's left? Short answers. Defensive tones. Or silence that feels safer than saying the wrong thing. That's when our rule appeared. Not in a dramatic conversation. Not in therapy. It came out during a completely ordinary moment, standing in the kitchen, late evening, dishes half done. We realized that every conversation had turned into a tiny battle of energy. Who's more tired? Who listens less? Who explains worse? And suddenly, we agreed on one rule that sounded almost too simple to matter. The rule was this: when one of us is tired, we speak slower, or we don't speak at all. No pushing. No, just say it quickly. No forcing clarity when the brain is foggy. At first, it felt awkward. Unproductive. Even childish. But something unexpected happened. The emotional temperature dropped. Our bodies relaxed before our words improved. Psychologists call this regulation before communication. Your nervous system needs safety before language can work. And slow speech, pauses, softer tones, fewer words, is one of the fastest ways to signal safety. It's why children calm down when adults slow their voice. It's why you understand English better when someone speaks clearly, not cleverly. And yes, English quietly entered our marriage right there. Not as a lesson. Not as practice. Just simple phrases. Can we pause? I'm tired. Let's talk later. Easy words. Slow rhythm. Real meaning. Suddenly, English wasn't something I failed at during the day. It was something that helped me survive the evening. What surprised me most was this: the rule didn't fix our problems. It gave us space to stay connected while being imperfect. And that's where learning, love or language, actually happens. Not when you push harder, but when you make things gentle enough to continue. So before you think this story is about marriage, or English, or America, pause for a second. Ask yourself, what would change if you allowed slowness to be a rule, not a weakness? Because this rule didn't save us by making us better. It saved us by making us human. 4 weeks changed everything. 4 weeks sounds short, right? Like something you can tolerate by telling yourself, just get through this. But time doesn't hit the same when every day asks you to adapt, translate, explain, and stay emotionally present at the same time. 4 weeks in the United States didn't just change our schedule. It quietly rewired how we understood marriage, family, and the way pressure shows up in your body before it ever shows up in your words. What made these weeks different wasn't America itself. It was the constant low-level effort. Your brain never fully rests when everything around you requires interpretation. Signs, conversations, school emails, even casual jokes at the grocery store. Psychologists call this cognitive load. When it stays high for too long, motivation doesn't disappear dramatically. It leaks out slowly. You stop wanting to explain. You stop asking questions. You stop learning, not because you're lazy, but because your system is protecting itself. In our house, this showed up in strange ways. We weren't fighting. We were efficient. Too efficient. Conversations became logistical. Who picks up the kids? What time dinner is? Did you reply to that message? Love shrank into a checklist. And here's the part no one warns you about. When communication becomes purely functional, emotional connection doesn't break. It fades. Quietly. Politely. Dangerously. Our kids felt it before we admitted it. Children are incredible nervous system readers. They don't analyze tone, they absorb it. One night, after a long day, my child asked me a question in English. I answered too fast, too sharp, not angry, just empty. And they went silent. That moment hit harder than any argument. It wasn't about language. It was about presence. Science backs this up in an uncomfortable way. Emotional availability depends on something called attentional bandwidth. When your mind is overloaded, you literally have less capacity to care, even about the people you love most. This is why couples under chronic stress often say, "We still love each other, but something feels off." Nothing is off. You're just exhausted at a neurological level. That's when our rules started to feel necessary, not optional. Slowness wasn't a romantic idea anymore. It became a survival tool. We stopped correcting each other's words. Stopped finishing sentences. Stopped pushing clarity when confusion was actually a signal to rest. And something subtle shifted. The house felt quieter, not empty but breathable. Here's the surprising part for anyone watching this to learn English. During those weeks, I didn't improve my English by studying more. I improved it by using less short sentences, clear pauses, repeated phrases. The kind of English your brain can digest when it's tired. Research shows that comprehension increases dramatically when speech speed drops, especially under stress. Slower input reduces cognitive load. Your brain finally has time to connect meaning instead of panicking. Marriage works the same way. When conversations slow down, your emotional brain catches up. You start hearing intention, not just tone. You notice care hiding behind clumsy words. That's what 4 weeks taught us. Not how to fix everything, but how to stop making things worse. So if you're watching this feeling behind in English, behind in love, behind in life, hear this clearly. Falling behind is often just a sign that you've been carrying too much alone. 4 weeks didn't make us stronger. They made us more honest about our limits. And that honesty became the beginning of change. Why we needed one rule. Most rules in marriage are created after something goes wrong. Ours was created right before things quietly fell apart. Not in a dramatic way. More like a slow emotional dehydration. You don't notice it until everything feels dry, heavy, and harder to swallow, especially words. By the 3rd week in the US, something became clear. We weren't misunderstanding each other because of English, or stress, or parenting. We were misunderstanding each other because we kept talking past our limits. Every conversation assumed the other person had the same energy, the same focus, the same emotional bandwidth. That assumption was wrong. And it was costing us connection. There's a concept in psychology called the window of tolerance. It's the emotional range where your brain can process information without going into fight, flight, or shutdown. When you're outside that window, even loving words feel like pressure. That's where we were living. Outside the window. Every day. And no amount of trying harder was going to pull us back in. So we needed a rule that respected biology, not just intention. The rule wasn't about being nice. It was about timing. If one of us felt overloaded, the conversation stopped or slowed down. No explanations required. No emotional debt created. This mattered more than it sounds. Because most couples don't fight about content. They fight about timing. One person is ready to talk. The other is neurologically unavailable. And the result feels personal, even though it isn't. At first, my brain hated this rule. It felt like avoidance. Like postponing the truth. But then something interesting happened. When we delayed conversations, they didn't grow heavier. They grew clearer. When your nervous system calms down, memory improves, language improves, empathy improves. Neuroscience calls this state co-regulation. 2 people helping each other return to emotional balance. And this is where English learning quietly connected again. You know that feeling when someone speaks too fast and your brain freezes? That's not lack of intelligence. That's your nervous system detecting overload. Slowing down isn't lowering the standard. It's meeting the brain where it actually functions. We started modeling this for our kids without meaning to. Slower answers. Softer corrections. More listening than explaining. Their behavior changed too. Less resistance. More questions. More attempts at speaking, even when grammar wasn't perfect. Safety does that. It invites effort. There's research showing that people learn languages better in emotionally safe environments. Mistakes feel less threatening, so the brain stays open. Marriage is the same classroom. When you don't fear emotional consequences, you try more. You listen longer. You stay. By the end of that week, the rule no longer felt like a restriction. It felt like permission. Permission to be unfinished. Permission to pause. Permission to say, I can't right now, without destroying trust. And here's the part that might surprise you. The rule didn't reduce honesty. It improved it. When we spoke, we meant it. When we stayed silent, it was respectful, not resentful. That difference changes everything. So if you're wondering why love or learning feels harder lately, ask yourself this. Are you asking your brain to perform while it's overwhelmed? Because sometimes, the most loving rule isn't about what you say. It's about when you stop. Love under daily pressure. No one warns you that love doesn't usually collapse under tragedy. It bends under repetition. The same mornings. The same responsibilities. The same tired conversations that sound reasonable but feel empty. Under daily pressure, love doesn't scream. It whispers less. By the fourth week, our days had developed a rhythm that looked stable from the outside. Kids went to school. Meals happened on time. Messages were answered. Bills were tracked. From a distance, it all worked. But inside the relationship, something subtle was happening. We were present physically, absent emotionally. And that's the kind of absence that confuses you, because nothing is wrong enough to justify the distance. Daily pressure does something sneaky to the brain. When stress becomes predictable, your nervous system stops signaling urgency and starts conserving energy. This is called functional shutdown. You're not depressed. You're not angry. You're just operating on low power mode. In that state, love becomes procedural. You care, but you don't feel curious. You listen, but you don't absorb. That's when small misunderstandings start to matter more than they should. A tone sounds colder. A delay feels intentional. A short answer feels dismissive. Not because the other person changed, but because your brain is searching for threat when it's tired. Under pressure, the mind fills in gaps with worst-case stories. English made this more intense. When you're already mentally drained, processing a second language costs extra energy. So when my partner spoke English at the end of the day, my patience thinned faster. Not because of the words, but because my cognitive reserve was gone. Psychologists compare this to decision fatigue. The more choices and interpretations you make during the day, the fewer resources you have left for empathy at night. This is where many people blame themselves. Why am I like this? Why can't I handle simple conversations? But biology doesn't care about your self-judgment. It cares about load. And our load was heavy. The rule we created didn't remove pressure. It created relief pockets inside it. Moments where we didn't have to perform love, explain love, or prove love. We just protected energy. And that protection slowly rebuilt warmth. One night, something small happened. We were both tired. The kids were finally asleep. Normally, this would be the time when tension sneaks in. Unfinished topics, unspoken frustrations. Instead, we looked at each other and said almost nothing. Just a few slow sentences. Clear. Gentle. Then silence. Not avoidance. Rest. That moment taught me something important. Love doesn't need constant expression. It needs nervous system permission to exist. When pressure drops, affection returns naturally. Like breathing after holding your breath too long. For anyone watching this to improve English, notice the parallel. Fluency doesn't grow under pressure. It grows when the brain feels safe enough to experiment. When you stop forcing speed, your accuracy improves. When you stop fearing mistakes, your voice shows up. Marriage is the same practice, just with higher stakes. Daily pressure didn't break us. It revealed how little margin we had left. The rule gave us margin again. Not by fixing everything, but by slowing enough to feel human inside our own lives. And once you feel human again, love doesn't need to be pushed. It remembers how to stay. Our children noticed first. Adults like to believe children don't notice the quiet shifts. We assume they hear words, not pauses. Sentences, not sighs. But kids are emotional radar systems. They pick up what we're too busy to name. And in our 4th week, they noticed something before we were ready to admit it ourselves. It wasn't a question at first. It was behavior. Shorter answers. Less spontaneous talking. More screen time requests. These weren't discipline issues. They were signals. When the emotional climate in a home changes, children adjust by conserving themselves. Just like adults do under pressure. One afternoon, my child tried to tell a story in English. Slow, imperfect, searching for words. Normally, I would gently correct, help finish the sentence, move things along. That day, I didn't. I remembered our rule. I slowed down. I waited. And something unexpected happened. They kept going. Paused. Tried again. And finished the thought on their own. That moment mattered more than it looked. In developmental psychology, there's a concept called attuned response. When adults match a child's pace instead of controlling it, the child's confidence increases. They feel safe enough to struggle publicly, to try, to stay in the conversation. That's when it hit me. Our rule wasn't just saving our marriage. It was teaching our children how to relate to pressure. How to speak when it's hard. How to listen without rushing to fix. Children don't learn communication from lectures. They learn it from rhythm, from tone, from how long silence is allowed to exist before someone fills it. When we slowed down, the house didn't become quieter, it became more expressive. More attempts. More honesty. This is why so many people freeze when speaking English as adults. Somewhere along the way, speed became more important than safety. Correctness mattered more than courage. The brain learned that mistakes equal risk. So it shuts down. Children don't start that way. They learn it from us. Our kids also noticed something else. We argued less, but not because we avoided conflict. We disagreed slower. That difference is everything. Slower disagreement leaves room for repair. Faster disagreement leaves scars. Research shows that children raised in homes with emotionally regulated communication develop better language skills and stronger emotional resilience. Not because their parents are perfect, but because the environment allows recovery. Mistakes aren't final. Words can be revisited. One night, my child asked a simple question. Why do we talk slower now? I didn't give a long answer. I said, so we don't hurt each other when we're tired. That was enough. They nodded. Like it made sense. Because it did. If you're watching this and thinking this is just a parenting story, look again. It's about modeling the conditions where learning survives stress, where love stays accessible, where English becomes a tool, not a test. Our children noticed first because they live closest to truth. They don't intellectualize distance. They feel it. And when the distance closed, even a little, they relaxed. Sometimes the clearest feedback about your marriage, your language, your life, comes from the smallest people watching how you handle being overwhelmed. And when you slow down for them, you often end up saving yourself too. English entered our home. English didn't enter our home like a textbook. It didn't knock politely or announce a lesson plan. It slipped in through tired conversations, school questions, half-finished sentences at the dinner table. And somehow, without us planning it, it became part of the emotional air we were breathing. Before these 4 weeks, English felt like performance. Something you either did well or failed quietly at. But under pressure, performance collapses. What survives is usefulness. English stayed because it helped us do one thing better: understand each other with less effort. We stopped trying to sound correct. We tried to sound clear. Short sentences. Familiar words. Pauses that gave the other person time to catch up emotionally, not just linguistically. This matches something linguists have known for a long time. Comprehension depends more on clarity than complexity. Slower speech, predictable structure, and emotional context improve understanding far more than advanced vocabulary. In our house, this showed up in small ways. "Can we pause?" became a real sentence, not a strategy. "I'm tired" replaced long explanations. Even silence became a shared language instead of a punishment. English stopped being foreign when it started carrying real feeling. Here's something most language courses don't tell you. Your brain learns language better when it's attached to meaning that matters. Neuroscience shows that emotionally relevant input is encoded more deeply in memory. That's why you remember phrases said during important moments, even if your grammar is imperfect. For me, English stopped being an obstacle and became a bridge. Not always a strong one, but enough to cross when needed. And that changed how I felt about learning. The shame faded. Curiosity returned. The same thing happened in our marriage. When language stopped being a tool for control or correction, connection came back. We didn't argue about words. We used words to protect energy. If you're watching this hoping to improve your listening or speaking, notice what's happening here. We didn't separate practice from life. Life was the practice. Slow, imperfect, emotionally real. There's a concept called low-stakes repetition. It's how children acquire language. No tests. No pressure. Just repeated exposure in safe environments. That's what our home became. Not a classroom, but a place where trying was allowed. By the end of that week, English felt less like noise and more like music you slowly learn to follow. You don't catch every note, but you feel the rhythm. And maybe that's the real shift. Language isn't about control. It's about timing. You don't force it. You enter when the moment is right. English entered our home not because we invited it, but because we slowed down enough to let it stay. Why we stop listening. People think they stop listening because they don't care anymore. That's comforting, in a way. It gives you a clean explanation. But the truth is messier and kinder. Most of the time, we stop listening because our brain is overloaded, not because our heart is empty. By the middle of our 4th week, I noticed something uncomfortable. Even when my partner spoke gently, part of me checked out. Not intentionally. My eyes were there. My body was there. But my mind drifted. This wasn't disrespect. It was neurological fatigue. Listening is expensive. It requires working memory, emotional regulation, and attention control. When you're under chronic stress, new country, kids, language, responsibility, those systems run on fumes. The brain prioritizes survival over connection. It filters out anything that isn't immediately necessary. Psychologists call this attentional narrowing. Under pressure, your focus shrinks. You hear the task, not the emotion. The instruction, not the intention. That's why couples under stress often say, "You're not listening," when what they really mean is, "You don't have the capacity right now." This hit me hardest during English conversations. When someone speaks in a second language, your brain works double time, decoding sound, translating meaning, predicting structure. When your energy is low, listening becomes exhausting. So the brain does what it's designed to do. It protects you by disengaging. The rule saved us here. Because it removed moral judgment from listening. We stopped treating inattention as a character flaw. It became a signal. "I can't listen well right now" was no longer an excuse. It was information. Once we accepted that, everything softened. We scheduled important conversations for times when our brains were more available. We shortened exchanges when energy dipped. And something surprising happened. Our listening improved, not because we tried harder, but because we respected limits. This is exactly how language learning works. People blame themselves for not understanding fast speech. But research shows comprehension drops sharply when cognitive load exceeds capacity. Slowing down isn't cheating. It's optimizing. In marriage, listening isn't about effort. It's about timing and safety. When those are present, listening feels natural. When they're missing, no amount of willpower helps. One night, I caught myself actually wanting to listen again. That desire had been missing for weeks. And it returned not after a breakthrough conversation, but after several quiet evenings where nothing was demanded. Listening came back when pressure left. So if you feel disconnected from someone you love, or frustrated with your English listening skills, ask a better question. Not what's wrong with me, but how overloaded am I? Because when the load drops, listening doesn't need to be forced. It wakes up on its own. And that's when communication stops feeling like work and starts feeling like contact again. The power of speaking slowly. Speaking slowly sounds simple. Almost insulting, honestly. Like advice you'd give to someone who hasn't tried hard enough. But slowness isn't about effort. It's about control over your nervous system. And during our 4th week, it became the most powerful tool we had. Here's the strange thing. When we slowed our speech, we didn't lose meaning, we gained it. Words landed. Pauses created space. Tone softened without us trying to be kind. This isn't poetic thinking. It's biology. Slow speech activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of your body responsible for calm, safety, and connection. Fast speech does the opposite. It signals urgency. Even if your words are loving, speed can trigger threat. That's why arguments escalate so quickly. It's not what's said. It's how fast it hits the listener's system. In our marriage, slowing down changed the emotional geometry of conversations. Sentences got shorter. Intentions got clearer. We didn't rush to finish each other's thoughts. We waited. And waiting felt respectful, not awkward. This mirrored exactly what happened with English. When I spoke slower, my pronunciation improved. My confidence increased. And people listened longer. Research in second language acquisition shows that slower output increases accuracy and listener comprehension. Your brain has time to plan, monitor, and adjust. There was a moment that made this undeniable. I needed to explain something emotional in English. Normally, I would rush, afraid of losing words. This time, I slowed down, paused, repeated a phrase. No he balayé. The other person leaned in. They understood, not because my grammar was perfect, but because my pace made room for meaning. That's when I realized something important. Speed is often a disguise for fear. Fear of being interrupted. Fear of sounding wrong. Fear of not being enough. When you slow down, those fears lose power. Our kids copied this immediately. They started speaking slower too, asking for time, repeating words without shame. Their fluency didn't jump overnight, but their willingness to speak did. And willingness is the real gateway. In marriage, speaking slowly isn't about control. It's about consent. You're giving the other person time to receive what you're saying. You're checking if their system is open. That changes everything. If you're learning English, this is your permission slip. Slower is not weaker. It's clearer. It's kinder. It's more effective. And if you're trying to save connection, romantic, familial, or internal, remember this. You don't need better words. You need better timing. Speaking slowly didn't solve our problems, but it stopped us from creating new ones. And that was enough to let healing begin. Small habits, big healing. People love big turning points. The dramatic talk at midnight. The tearful confession. The promise that from tomorrow, everything will be different. But healing doesn't trust big moments. Healing trusts repetition. And during those 4 weeks in the US, what saved our marriage, and quietly rebuilt our energy, were habits so small they almost felt invisible. Here's the truth most people don't want to hear. When you're exhausted, your brain cannot maintain grand intentions. Motivation collapses first. Discipline follows. What survives are automatic behaviors. So if your habits are sharp, rushed, and reactive, love will slowly bleed out. Not because you don't care, but because your system is running on emergency mode. We didn't fix our marriage. We reduced friction. The first habit was almost boring. Checking energy before opening a conversation. Not feelings. Not opinions. Energy. If one of us looked drained, the conversation automatically became shorter. Not postponed with resentment, shortened with respect. This single habit prevented countless misunderstandings. Psychology calls this load-aware communication. When cognitive load is high, emotional tolerance is low. Ignoring that fact doesn't make you brave. It makes you reckless. The second habit was even smaller. No correcting in the moment. Not grammar. Not wording. Not tone. Correction interrupts flow, and flow is where connection lives. Linguistic research shows that interruption increases anxiety and decreases recall, especially in second language speakers. But this applies emotionally too. When someone is expressing something fragile, correction tells their nervous system, "You're unsafe here." So we stopped. We let sentences land imperfectly. And something shifted. Conversations felt slower, but fuller. Less precise, but more honest. Then came the habit that surprised me the most: micropauses. 2 seconds of silence before responding. That's it. 2 seconds doesn't sound like anything. But neurologically it's huge. Those seconds allow the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, to stand down. They give the prefrontal cortex time to come back online. In plain language, you stop reacting and start responding. At first, those pauses felt awkward. Like we were hesitating. But hesitation turned into calm. Calm turned into clarity. And clarity reduced conflict without us needing to resolve anything. Our children felt the difference immediately. More attempts to talk. More questions. More English actually, spoken slowly with mistakes, without fear. This is how learning happens. Safety first. Accuracy later. Studies in child development consistently show that emotional safety increases language output far more than correction ever could. Here's the uncomfortable realization I had. We weren't failing at marriage or English. We were overwhelming ourselves. And overwhelmed systems don't grow. They survive. So we made survival gentler. We repeated phrases instead of expanding conversations. We accepted silence without filling it. We ended talks early when energy dipped instead of pushing for closure. None of this felt heroic. It felt practical. But practicality is underrated. Over time, these habits stacked. The emotional noise level dropped. Not happiness, quiet. And quiet created space. Space for affection to return naturally. Space for curiosity. Space for trying again. This is where most people get it wrong. They wait to feel better before acting differently. But behavior shapes emotion more reliably than emotion shapes behavior. We didn't wait to feel connected. We behaved in ways that allowed connection to reappear. For anyone learning English, this matters deeply. You don't need more vocabulary. You need fewer threats. Slower input. Repeated phrases. Permission to pause. The brain learns best when it's not defending itself. Marriage taught me that before any language book ever did. By the end of the 4th week, nothing in our life looked dramatically different. Same responsibilities. Same pressures. Same imperfections. But inside the relationship, something fundamental had shifted. We had stopped hurting each other accidentally. And that's what healing often is. Not becoming better people, but becoming less harmful under stress. Small habits didn't save us because they were clever. They saved us because they were sustainable. You don't need inspiration to pause for 2 seconds. You don't need confidence to let someone finish a sentence. You just need repetition. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It whispers, day after day, this is survivable. And sometimes, that whisper is enough to keep love and learning alive. From marriage to language practice. Something quietly radical happened during those 4 weeks. English stopped being a subject and started being a side effect. I didn't plan it. I didn't track it. I didn't even notice it at first. But the more our marriage stabilized, the more language stopped feeling heavy. Not because I learned faster, but because I learned differently. Before this, English lived in a separate mental room. That room had rules. Correctness mattered. Speed mattered. Confidence mattered. And every time I entered that room tired, I failed. Marriage pressure made that failure louder. When your emotional world feels unstable, your brain treats learning as a threat, not an opportunity. Neuroscience explains why. The brain prioritizes safety before growth. When emotional stress is high, the hippocampus, responsible for memory formation, reduces its activity. Translation: you can repeat words all day and still not retain them if your nervous system doesn't feel safe. That was me. The marriage rule changed the environment first. And once the environment changed, learning followed naturally. English began to appear inside real moments. Explaining feelings simply. Asking for time. Saying, "I don't understand" without shame. These phrases weren't exercises. They were tools. And tools stick because they solve problems. Cognitive science calls this utility-based learning. When language reduces effort or pain, the brain flags it as important. I stopped chasing new vocabulary. I reused the same sentences again and again. Slowly. Clearly. Repetition without pressure. Research in language acquisition shows that depth beats breadth. Fewer phrases, repeated in emotionally relevant contexts, create stronger neural pathways than endless new input. Marriage provided those contexts automatically. Every conversation mattered a little. Not dramatically, but enough for the brain to care. Listening improved too. I stopped translating word by word. I listened for intention. This is a high-level skill most learners never get taught. Native speakers don't process language perfectly. They predict meaning based on context, tone, and rhythm. Slowing down gave my brain time to do that prediction work. One evening, I realized I had understood a full conversation in English without trying. No inner translation. No panic. Just comprehension. That moment didn't feel exciting. It felt normal. And that's the point. Real progress feels quiet. I began to mirror this intentionally. At the end of the day, I would repeat one sentence aloud. Just one. Slowly. No correction. No performance. The next day, that sentence would appear naturally. This is how language integrates. Not through force, but through familiarity. Marriage taught me something language courses rarely mention. Learning accelerates when you stop trying to impress. When you aim to be understood instead of being correct. When your goal shifts from sound good to connect. The rule we created, slowing down under fatigue, became a learning principle. I stopped practicing English when I was exhausted. Instead, I practiced clarity. Fewer words. Better timing. More listening. For anyone watching this to improve their listening or speaking, take this seriously. Don't add English on top of an already overloaded life. Embed it inside what you're already doing. Use it to manage stress, not increase it. Marriage gave me feedback instantly. When language created calm, it stayed. When it created tension, it disappeared. That feedback loop was more effective than any app. By the end of those 4 weeks, my English wasn't dramatically better on paper. But it was alive. It functioned. It belonged to me. And that's the shift that lasts. Language isn't something you conquer. It's something that joins you when you make space for it. Just like love. Would you accept this rule? Let me ask you something directly. No theory, no romance, no motivational slogans. If your marriage, your family, or even your relationship with English had one rule, just one, would you choose slowness? And more importantly, would you accept the cost that comes with it? Because slowness is not passive. It costs pride. It costs urgency. It costs the illusion that you can power through everything with effort alone. When we first lived by this rule, slow down or stop when one of us is tired, it felt uncomfortable. Not emotionally. Socially. Slowness goes against how we're trained to survive. We're taught to explain, clarify, fix, respond quickly. Silence looks like failure. Pauses look like weakness. In reality, they are signals of awareness. The resistance didn't come from conflict. It came from habit. From the reflex to keep going even when the system is overloaded. Neuroscience has a blunt name for this reflex: stress persistence. The body stays in on mode long after it's no longer useful. That's when people say things they don't mean, hear things that weren't intended, and damage connection accidentally. Accepting the rule meant accepting something else too, that love doesn't need to be proven daily through effort. It needs to be protected through restraint. This was hardest during moments when something needed to be said. Important topics. Lingering tensions. Unresolved feelings. The temptation to push through fatigue is strongest when the stakes feel high. But those are exactly the moments where timing matters most. Studies in relationship psychology show that discussions initiated under emotional fatigue are far more likely to escalate, regardless of content. So we didn't avoid conversations. We delayed them until our nervous systems could cooperate. And when we returned to them, they were clearer, shorter, and kinder. Now here's where this connects to you, whether you're watching for marriage, family, or English practice. Most people don't quit because they don't care. They quit because everything feels too heavy at once. Learning. Loving. Functioning. The brain collapses under combined pressure. The rule separates load. It says, not everything needs to happen now. That alone restores agency. In language learning, this is radical. Instead of pushing speed, you honor comprehension. Instead of forcing output, you protect willingness. Research consistently shows that learners who feel in control of pacing persist longer and achieve higher long-term fluency. In marriage, the same principle applies. When people feel safe to pause, they stay. When they feel rushed emotionally, they withdraw. Accepting the rule also meant redefining progress. Progress wasn't talking more. It was hurting less. Progress wasn't fluency. It was clarity. That shift removed pressure from every interaction. So would you accept this rule? Would you allow yourself to stop explaining when your body says no? Would you choose fewer words over sharper ones? Would you let silence exist without filling it with guilt? Most people say yes in theory. In practice, it feels terrifying. Because slowness reveals things. It exposes fatigue. It removes performance. It asks you to trust that connection doesn't disappear just because you paused. But here's what 4 weeks taught me. When connection is real, it survives pauses. When learning is healthy, it tolerates slowness. The rule didn't make us perfect partners or confident speakers. It made us sustainable. And sustainability is what keeps relationships, and language, alive long enough to grow. So before you scroll away, before you judge this as too simple, ask yourself honestly, what would happen if you stopped pushing and started pacing? Because sometimes, the bravest rule isn't try harder. It's slow down and stay. A hopeful way forward. There's a strange relief that comes when you stop asking life to speed up for you. When you accept that some seasons are meant to be slow, not as punishment, but as preparation. By the end of those 4 weeks, nothing about our life in the US looked easier on the surface. The responsibilities were still there. The language was still imperfect. The kids were still loud, curious, and exhausting in the way only children can be. But inside us, something fundamental had shifted. We were no longer fighting time. That might sound abstract, but it's practical in a way most advice isn't. Fighting time looks like rushing conversations, forcing clarity, demanding answers when the body is already tired. Making peace with time looks like pacing. And pacing changes outcomes more reliably than effort ever will. The hopeful part of this story isn't that our marriage suddenly became strong or calm. It's that it became continuable. That's the word people rarely use, but it matters most. A relationship doesn't need to feel amazing every day. It needs to feel possible tomorrow. The same is true for learning English. Most people quit not because they fail, but because they can't imagine continuing without burning out. Hope returns when the path feels survivable. And survivability comes from reducing pressure, not increasing motivation. Our rule created a future we could imagine staying in. We didn't promise each other endless patience. We promised awareness. We didn't swear to communicate perfectly. We committed to stopping before harm. That's a much more realistic form of love. Psychologically, this works because the brain builds trust through predictability. When you know that fatigue won't be punished, you relax. When you know mistakes won't escalate, you try again. Safety restores curiosity. Curiosity fuels growth. That's why, near the end of the 4th week, something surprising happened. We started talking about the future again, not in grand plans, but in small images. Another school term. Another routine. Another video. Another attempt. Hope returned quietly, without ceremony. English followed the same pattern. It stopped feeling urgent. And once urgency left, progress appeared. Listening became easier. Speaking felt less risky. Not fluent, but alive. This is the message I wish someone had told me earlier. Progress that lasts rarely feels impressive in the moment. It feels normal. Almost boring. But boring is stable. And stability is where real change grows. If you're watching this feeling behind, in love, in language, in life, please hear this clearly. You don't need to catch up. You need to settle in. Into a pace you can sustain. Into rules that protect energy. Into habits that don't demand heroics. Our marriage didn't survive because we became better people. It survived because we became more honest about our limits. And limits, when respected, don't shrink life. They shape it. So here's the hopeful way forward. Speak slower than your fear. Pause before your nervous system breaks trust. Choose habits you can repeat on bad days, not just good ones. Let language serve connection, not ego. Let love rest when it's tired. And if you're using this channel to practice listening, reading, and speaking English, remember this: you're not training for speed. You're training for staying present. That skill transfers everywhere. For weeks didn't give us answers. They gave us direction. Not faster. Not louder. Not perfect. Just forward, at a human pace. Maybe your marriage once had a rule too. You just never dared to name it. And maybe the reason you haven't given up on English yet isn't because you're good at it, but because somewhere inside, you still believe that going slowly doesn't mean failing. The real question isn't, can you learn faster? It's this: can you keep going, even when progress feels quiet? In the next videos, I'll keep sharing real stories about marriage, children, life in the US, and how English quietly becomes part of your life when you stop forcing yourself to be perfect. If you're learning English while carrying a busy life, if you're in love but also exhausted, if you want a place to listen slowly, understand deeply, and speak without fear of mistakes, this channel is for you. Subscribe to the channel, not to learn faster, but to not give up alone. The next video will begin with a question many people have avoided for far too long.